Good afternoon and welcome to this new session of our doctoral seminar series for 2022. My name is Dominique Samda. I'm a research fellow at HUMA at the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. The seminar is streaming on Facebook and you will find the recording of the session later on the HUMA YouTube channel. The doctoral seminar series are scheduled every first and third Wednesday of the month. So be aware of that. To ensure the safety of the session, we're asking the participants to please include their full names in the Zoom room. You might find yourself temporarily placed in the waiting room if you don't rename yourself. In the doctoral seminar series, we invite our guests to reflect on the challenges and strategies of doctoral work with a particular focus on the turning points and critical experiences that shaped their research journey. We are also interested in hearing about innovative research methods and projects. Our speaker today, Dr. Marie Rodet, will discuss a public history project about resistance and displacement in post-slavery Mali. And it's about the webdoc Bouillagui, a free village. It's a very important topic for us at HUMA, and it has to do with the aftermath of the abolition of slavery in Mali. We're also thrilled to discuss this topic and these methods with Dr. Rodet because of a use of film and other media in our research. And I know there's a lot of doctoral fellows at HUMA that are interested actually in using media and films in their research projects. I confess, I have myself used Marie's first documentary in my courses on slavery and memory in Africa. I've done that a few years ago and a few times with great success. So I'm familiar with your work, Marie. So a more formal introduction, Dr. Marie Rodet is a reader at in the history of Africa at SOAS University in London, in the UK. Her research interests lie in modern migration history, gender studies, and the history of slavery in West Africa. She has extensively published on the history of slavery in Western Mali, including the documentary film, the one that I've used, the Diamburu, Slavery and Emancipation in KS Mali, 2014, and the web documentary, so that we are discussing today, Bouillagui, a free village. So it was released in 2020. Dr. Marie Rodet, welcome. Thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dom, for the invitation, and I'm very glad to be with you today to present you some of the research I've been doing for some time now. As Dominique mentioned already, in 2010, I filmed the documentary, The Diamburu, which was my first documentary, and which was released officially only 4 years later because of limited financial and technical means, but that has to some extent affected the result. Still, I'm still happy with it and happy to use it also in my teaching. But after this first experience as doing a first documentary, I felt that I had not been able to mobilize the full potential of this first film investigation. And I was looking for an opportunity to use other brushes, film brushes, or to revisit those already used in the film. And I didn't want to make another documentary because I would have had the feeling it's a kind of repetition. It was also the idea of diversifying the media used for my research, and make my research outcomes accessible to a wider audience. That's how I started with a documentary, The Diamburu, and I continued this journey about how making our knowledge and our research accessible to a wider public. I had been wanting to use another audiovisual medium for some time, and I was particularly interested in the possibilities of web documentaries. That's something which is maybe a bit less known as a medium in the Anglophone sphere, but this is increasingly more used in the French-speaking world and French-speaking research. So I'm not the first one doing this, but that was probably the first one ever on the topic of slavery. So this became a reality in 2020 when I was lucky enough to get financial support from SOAS for this new project, Bouillagui, a free village. What I really liked and why I decided to go for this medium as a second experience of multimedia, audiovisual experiment, was the possibility of using a large set of material that I had accumulated for my research on the topic of slavery and post-slavery in Western Mali since 2008, and to make them accessible and to value them in another way than just by published texts that will have remained mostly confined to a small cycle of readers. The web documentary also made it possible to add more text than in the documentary, which permits to contextualize the video material in more details. And that was also a good way of giving more contextualization to the audience. So more generally, I mean, this webdoc is embedded in a broader journey, as I was mentioning before, the fact that I've been increasingly interested in the issue of making our knowledge as researchers as accessible as possible to the larger public, but also this idea of co-production of knowledge, and especially of hardly known local knowledge in West Africa. So that's how I've been working with a local NGO in Mali for the past 5 years, which is called Donkosira, and that's also why I'm today in Bamako, organizing a training with them to conduct further research for one of our joint projects. That's how we, since 2018, we started a joint journey in developing a number of teaching and public history tools about historical struggles against slavery that can inspire, in particular, the younger generation in Mali and beyond to fight against all forms of exploitation, including modern slavery. So it's within this framework that this webdoc was made. We also did, it's not finished, but it's in good shape, a graphic novel and an animation film, which should be released, I think, at the latest by the end of this year, hopefully. And we have started screening the webdoc in schools, in particularly in Western Mali, where Bouillagui, the village of Bouillagui, is located, and we work now on developing a mobile app, because that's one of the things, unfortunately, that we noticed too late, is that the webdoc is not readable on mobile phones, which is really not convenient in today's world. So I'm just explaining broadly the context of production and what we've been doing with it, with the web documentary. And then I should have said, of course, I will partly screen it by sharing my screen. The webdoc has been sold as a practical teaching aid for distance learning as well. It was not planned this way, but it happened to be published in the middle of the pandemic and of the lockdown in 2020. And of course, the audience of students, especially in Europe and North America, logically became the main audience. The feedback was varied, but students seemed to be particularly touched by the fact that they could access these rare and direct testimonies from their homes. In particular, the testimonies allowed them to perceive the traumatic aspect of slavery, the psychological violence, which can be difficult to capture as directly through scientific publication and academic articles and books. And actually, I wanted to explore more the issues of the trauma of slavery with a camera in my documentary and to find a visual language to convey it at the time in a stronger way. But that was my first documentary film. So as I said in the beginning, I felt limited at some point. That's why rereading this material and having the possibility to contextualize it through text on the web was a way of alleviating what I saw as some weaknesses from the first documentary. And the difference also with a documentary is that with the jamboree is that in this one, in some of the short videos I added, I decided with a team that I will add a voiceover, which I didn't want to do in the first documentary, and we can talk about that. Why adding a voiceover and why not, and what motivated me to do it this time and not the previous time. And what is interesting is, so if you have the opportunity to watch the first documentary, I mean, we can add probably the link in the chat later on. But between the first documentary and the webdoc, it has been 10 years time. So of course, my own research has evolved, and my approach to this research has evolved as well. Even if I had known Bouillagui since 2009. So and Bouillagui was already featured as a village and part of the story of the Jumbo. I think the context was quite different when I did the first documentary. I was much younger, and that was just 2 years after my defense, my viva. So I was less. I mean, in my PhD dissertation, I mostly used, if not only, archives and colonial archives. And it's really following my PhD that I did some interviews, but that was quite limited in comparison with what I will do after during the years following my PhD when I embarked really on a almost full oral history project on slavery. And so of course the material was somehow different. Bouillagui was the first steps, the first part of these first outcomes, results, preliminary results of this research on oral history, while Bouillagui is kind of closing, not completely closing, but kind of closing this journey, in which I ultimately embraced completely this oral history project, hardly checking any archives anymore. So archives basically don't feature in this project at all. And Bouillagui doesn't feature at all in these archives. And that's why that was a strong, symbolically a strong move for me, and overall to act against the invisibilization of local historic fighting against slavery outside or on the margins of colonial emancipatory networks. And ultimately, that will be my last point before I show you. I partly screen this webdoc. My own research took a whole new dimension with increase in violence against people considered locally in Kai as descendants of slaves, not slaves. And who have been organizing themselves for some years for equality in the villages, fighting against being called slaves, particularly within the organization Gambana, which means all equal in Soninke, which is one of the many local languages which are spoken in this part of Mali. And I got in touch with a Gambana activist in Paris to share my work with them. In particular, my documentary at first, because I didn't have really the webdoc yet. We screened together the documentary, the Diambo, and we plan now to screen the webdoc in Paris again. And in sharing my work with activists, I wanted to make the link between past and present struggles, a link that is often purposely repressed by the dominant classes, so that with each new generation, resistance against descent-based slavery cannot rely on past struggles to legitimize and strengthen their action. And that's why it was so important for me to do the link and to mention the change of context in Mali in one of the videos of the webdoc, and to acknowledge this link, because the history of Bouillagui, which is a history of fighting against slavery, is not known outside the boundaries of this village. And all the villages, and actually the village has been ostracized by the surrounding villages to prevent their history from inspiring other revolutions. So to this day, very few people outside of Bouillagui know this story, which is less and less also transmitted even within Bouillagui to the younger generation. That's where our work with our intervention with the organization Don Kosera impacted. So just to finish on that, because I see I'm taking already too much time. So with the Bouillagui webdoc, I really wanted to go beyond what I had done with the Jamburu and to assert this legitimacy of this history more strongly. And at the same time, I could not ignore current events on these issues, the current fights and violence, which is still happening in this part of Mali because of these legacies of slavery. So it was important with this webdoc to show the often dramatic consequences of this slavery past on the people who are still considered locally to be descendants of slaves, and that this history, because it is not that well known and this is often ignored, it allows in some parts that this violence continues behind the walls of these villages. And that's the whole issues we had with one another projects was to make this fight against discrimination based on descent-based slavery and fight against this violence a legitimate fight for the local authorities in Mali, because they dismiss what was happening as being slavery and they will just discriminate the victims, saying anyway they are the one who bring troubles to the social order, as usual with any social movements, to dismiss the legitimacy of these movements. And that was part of this current project we still have, was to make the authorities in Mali and people in power to understand that they couldn't ignore what was happening in this region. That was potentially a time bomb if nothing was done. So I'm sure you're very excited now to watch what I've been talking about for almost 30 minutes. Let me just share my screen. So I'm typing the address so that you see the address is bouillagui.soas, ACUK. Hope you can see it. So I'm loading. And you will see, I don't know if you see it because of, okay, so it starts with, you just have to click play, the middle. Oh, let me just skip to this one because I was looking for it. Yeah, you see in the top right-hand corner of the screen, you can choose either French or English. So I'm sorry, I didn't see that, but it was in French. Now it's in English. You can choose the language. So this is the introductory video. So then you click on explore this history with an introductory screen. Explaining the context of the research. Then you see at the top right-hand corner, at the bottom, sorry, next, you click on next, and then there are a number of chapters. You see at the bottom the different chapters. Chapter 1 on internal slavery, chapter 2 on Bouillagui, and chapter 3 on memories, and with the last chapter on the resources. So again, an introductory text on the left-hand side of the screen with some insert, like if you click here, to have like footnotes to some extent. Here, chronology, short one. And then on the right-hand side, you have 4 videos that you can click on, starting with the first one. Now, I'm sorry, my connection is not great, so that's why it stops. But of course, with a better connection, you shouldn't have any issues. So for some who are familiar with my first documentary, those are excerpts from interviews I did, which were re-edited and with new subtitles. So this is an introduction to what is basically internal slavery in West Africa. Then we move to chapter 2, Bouillagui, Land of Resistance Against Slavery, with again a number of interviews, some from, again, the first documentary, we edited and resubtitled, but others new.
Je m'appelle Djibi Sissoko, je suis de Bouillagui, j'ai 67 ans. Bouillagui, comment Bouillagui est venu ici? Nos papas et nos grands-pères sont venus ici un mois avant l'hivernage. Donc à ce temps, ils avaient commencé même à cultiver à Cernati des champs. Il y a une petite dispute entre 2 gars. Donc ils ont dit allons-y, nous allons partir s'installer à un lieu qui s'appelle Bouillagui. Il y a les revenus ici. Il y a le baobab comme nourriture. Il y a du poisson aussi. Même quand on n'a pas 10 000, on pourra ramasser le baobab. On va ramasser les jujubes. Et nous allons aller pêcher du poisson aussi. Et là, nous allons manger à notre faim. Même demain, nous ramassons le baobab et nous le vendons même. Nous payons à l'aide de ces petits commerces. Nous habillons nos enfants à partir de cet argent. Nous prenons même du baobab, le piler, le mettre dans du mil et le manger. Jusqu'à aujourd'hui, nous mangeons ça. Mais Dieu merci. Nous sommes là aujourd'hui.
And what I should specify in the case of these 2 videos at the bottom, though how we conceive this project as the same with the graphic novel and the animation film, and so that was we equipped 5 villagers with mobile phones, and we trained them to use them as to film and record interviews about the history of the villages, and that's how we put this knowledge together to worked together on the script of the graphic novel, for example. The third chapter is more related to the memories of slavery today. And it's where I introduce the work we did in Bouillagui as the last, and why it is important to know this history. And I make the link with the current fight by the victims of descent-based slavery in Western Mali to reach equality and to fight against violence, of which they are victims. So I don't know if I have the time to play the video again.
In January 2019, the Malian Association Donkosira proposed to the Bouillagui Primary School that Hawa Sissoko, a grandmother from the village who knows well the history of its foundation, should share her knowledge with the pupils. It was important that this history was taught in Soninke in the Bouillagui Primary School by a woman from the village. The pupils were particularly impressed by the determination and the courage of the formerly enslaved to leave the village of their former masters. Indeed, when they rebelled, they took with them everything they possessed, and even their huts in mud that they carried by hand. They didn't hesitate either to fight against their former masters, who attacked them once they had left to prevent them from settling in Bouillagui. Since 2018, along with the Bouillagui villagers and with the support of Donkosira, we started working on the script of a graphic novel and an animation film about the village's history of resistance against slavery. The idea is to use this media to introduce the younger generations to issues such as citizenship, human rights, and the fight against discrimination and modern slavery.
And the last panel is about resources we used with some biographical references, the credits, and also a couple of questions that can be used to reflect with students on this history. I think I've been talking too much, so I will just stop it here, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Marie. I wonder if we could. Do you mind? Maybe.
Yeah, I'm stopping sharing.
Exactly, and maybe we can have this. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, no, I'm so. Your work is so interesting, and I've been like kind of following from afar, like the different media that you have been involved with, and I've been, you know, I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to start with two. My first question would be like, you know, considering like the different output that you designed, created, and disseminated, like, are you already able to measure, assess like the impact of that the different kind of media have on different generations, for example, like graphic novels versus film? I think you also had experience with like theater and plays, etc. So I'm really interested if you have any perspective on how the different media impact different kind of people. And my second question, because I know that you have recently published an article on data ethics and digital humanities. I'm wondering if you also have those questions in mind when you put something online that is that arrives in the context of like violence in Mali against the descendants of slaves. So yeah, I think I would start with those questions, and then we will open for everybody. And everybody, you can type your questions or unmute yourself and ask the question. So we'll take questions after that.
Yeah, thank you for both questions, which are very important, of course. The first one regarding the deep impact of different media on different audiences. First, the graphic novel is not finished yet, so we haven't been able to use it yet, but we have screened it. So we screened the preliminary sketches to the people in Bouillagui, and we presented it in conferences and in trainings we did with different stakeholders. The webdoc, we also did the same. What I noticed was, the younger generation didn't know anything about this history most of the time. So they were very surprised and shocked, and they realized that they had inherited some habits and behaviors from these legacies of slavery, but without being aware that was the case. Basically, they will use the term, getting back to my first documentary, they will use the term the Diamburu as a derogatory word, which I think is not by any chance. I was not surprised, basically, that the meaning of this word went missing in the real meaning of the word went missing in the memories. But it was transformed to become a derogatory word. So it means the Diamburu, the people who fought for their freedom and who settled. So they were said to be without being with any attach and being independent, etc. So there are a lot of definitions about this word, but the younger generation was really using that as an insult among themselves. In Kai, the main city in Mali. The webdoc, the older generation, some had known about this history, knew about the history of slavery, but had no idea about the history of fighting against slavery and resistance. And some were very impressed because either they had known about this history of slavery because it was running in the family, and they would come to me saying, wow, this is my history. They were very impressed the fact that they could see it on screen, and others who were not concerned immediately by this history because it was or who didn't want to be linked to this history. There is all things about silencing this history and detaching yourself from this history to make sure you are not linked to it, and who will have quite ambiguous reaction, not knowing whether they could acknowledge it, but at the same time that was on screen, So they were in a difficult position sometimes, but they acknowledged that that was an important historical work. So a number of people, again, that's my impression, it's subjective, but a number of people, adults, were purposefully or because they didn't have to take into account this history, they ignore it until they saw it on screen. They watch it on screen. And that the thing is, as it's on screen, they can no longer ignore it because they've seen it. It may not have completely changed their mind about what this history is what the legacies of this history is in today's Mali, but they couldn't ignore it, and they were somehow touched by this first-hand memories of slavery. And I mean, that's something as a non-Bambara speaker or non-Soninke speaker, maybe we cannot touch watching this documentary, both of these works, but this is something extremely strong, and that was my feeling, to hear these stories in your own language. And that's why that was disturbing for some of them, because they had ignored all that and saying it doesn't exist, or this is just the way the society is. But when they heard the victims, the descendants of these victims, saying the stories of their grandparents in their own language, that was, I mean, they had a moment of hesitation, and you could see it impacted them in a way. Yeah. The second question is about ethics. I only, of course, screened user material for which I had the authorization, the consent of the people who were filmed. And part of the way of making it, as I said, a public history project was to make it a community project in some aspect. So that's why we did this series of tools. We produced them together. At least the framework, the story. Technically, I didn't produce this webdoc, obviously. So I use a firm to help me out, to help us out. But we all contributed to the emergence of this history and the script and everything. So, and with a graphic novel, what we've been doing, for example, is to go back to the village. Each time we had a new page, and to make sure that they agreed on the script, they added their own comments, and they said, well, you should add these dialogues that will make it more vivid, and not just historical comments, but also even partly fictional comments to make the story better, basically. So we really did a great work together, which was a way of, I see this work, and this comes back to ethics and who I am as a researcher to write this history. We wrote this. I used the means I had, the financial means, the technical means, the access to them, to help this community and these villages to write the story. So in that sense, that's a co-production. I don't want to ignore still the hierarchies, won't change it. I'm white, I'm French, I'm well aware of all this, but I tried as much as possible to include everyone in this process, and Don Coursera was extremely helpful and supportive for that, because of the pandemic as well. I couldn't travel that much anymore, so they made the central link between me and the villagers. I mean, they maintained the contact while I couldn't be there physically, and in that sense, that's the way I see all the kind of reflection we had around production of knowledge by whom, about whom, for whom.
Thank you, Marie. We have one raised hand, and we also have a question, two questions, sorry. So the first is from Sandra Green, and if you want, you can unmute yourself, or I will read it. Okay, I'm going to read it. Every historian has to make choices on what they emphasize in any project. With that in mind, I wondered about the reaction of the masters to the departure of their enslaved people, what their responses were, how the self-emancipated responded to their masters' reactions, and how this figured into your decision in terms of what you focused on in the film.
Right, that's a great question as well. So I make this decision to give the full floor to the descendants of the enslaved and to the victims of descent-based slavery. That was a director's choice, a researcher's choice, because it's a question I often have. You should bring forward both sides of the so-called debate, which is to my mind no debate, but so that we understand the dynamics. And but the problem is that the other side, they had for the full history, the full floor and the full stage, and we have heard only their voices so far, almost. And each time we organized, actually, in other projects, trainings and meetings, and that was always a question whether we will invite the other side and how we will deal with that. And the few times we did, it silenced. They managed to silence or to make the one of the other side extremely angry and upset. That was a very upsetting experience, because these people are still in power. So they have still the means to silence these populations. And that's why there is violence today. The violence is used to silence them. I know that there is the so-called historical neutrality. We're never neutral, and that was a completely assumed decision to open the space, a safe space where these people, these populations, these so-called descendants of the enslaved, the ones who are categorized and still victims of descent-based slavery today, could speak without being threatened, without being just opening this kind of safe space. And I didn't want any other voices to shadow what they have to say. I don't know if I answered the question.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you, Marie. We have a raised hand. Vanessa, would you like to unmute? And then we have like a kind of definition question from Azar, and we'll ask you that question later. Vanessa.
All right. Thank you so much, Dom, and thank you, Marie, as well. So I'm sensing that in some ways, there's like a tension between whether or not this history is one that is drawn on, the slave history. And I'm just wondering if you could say more on something you had started to talk about. You mentioned that in some ways there is a silencing or maybe a reluctance to draw in that history, but I'm also wondering if you could say more on when it is drawn upon, at what moments, or what are some of the instances that happen that people feel a little less reluctant to draw on that history? Is that history used to frame certain conditions in the present moment, or certain social phenomena as they happen? Yeah, so I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. And thanks again for the presentation.
Thank you for this great question again. It's not an easy one because the interview I did and the work I did was in the 2010s and then 10 years later. So I don't know if I could have made this project in the 1970s or the 1980s. I have my own hypothesis about that, but this is, again, my subjective take on this. But when I did the first interviews in the early 2010s, it was still a time in Mali where, they had almost 20 years of democracy. And these populations, many of these interviews, all these interviews I did was with people who were living in villages whose grandparents or ancestors had founded to escape slavery. So these spaces were safe for them. By doing this documentary and this work and this research, what I gradually managed to understand is this history was known within the village, and it was a safe space to talk about it. But as soon as they would leave the village, it was no longer a safe space for them. The only way some of this, and this is not specific to this history, but of Western Mali, but you can see it elsewhere, is there are different strategies to survive the trauma of slavery and to build. It's extremely difficult as a historian, of course, to retrace that. But we can have, again, some hypotheses based on the work we do. And one way is, and that's part of my work, is to use migration to escape this social environment where it's not possible to escape the stigma of slavery. And on the other hand, to silence this history for the next generations so that they don't inherit this trauma. It doesn't mean that they don't, but at least they cannot. There is a choice, I suspect, to not talk about the genealogy and the history of the family, so that there is not this transmission of knowledge, so that they don't feel, the next generations don't live with this stigmatization that it's the history disappears. But all these strategies basically don't question the overall hierarchies in the society, which still persist, because there hasn't been a true revolution, I would say, on this matter. And so outside of these safe villages, basically in other neighboring villages, you still have these hierarchies existing. And you, as soon as you leave your village, actually you fall back. You have the risk to fall back into these hierarchies. If you marry someone from a village where there are still these hierarchies existing, you have no choice but to accept what is happening. until the recent violence and the past 2 years in Western Mali, nobody wanted to acknowledge this history in the public space. My work was very, I'm just a historian. I'm trying to make it known a bit, but I'm just a single historian. It's not a massive project. So the impact of what I'm doing, I'm not saying there is no impact, but it's still limited. And as long as the Malians themselves don't embrace the topic, there won't be much happening. What happened in the past 2 years, and I think that's a crucial moment of change, potentially, unfortunately, in very bad circumstances, because there have been tremendous violence. People were killed because they refused to be called slaves. So it went extremely far, and it's not finished, unfortunately. But it has put the topic on the public space, and to the extent that the authorities could no longer ignore the topic. And with social media and the circulation, the almost immediate circulation of information on that, the potentially it was risking even the reputation of Mali on the public stage, on the international stage, even if Mali is struggling with enough other issues at the moment. But still, being branded in the media as a country where slavery is still alive, it's not something, of course, the public authorities were very keen to hear. But I think in that sense, there is a change, and a number of projects, a number of work has been done even by international organizations to know more about what was happening. So that's where I see the change comparison with. I didn't say there were not small changes, but they were less visible. And I think in this case, social media played a central role in circulating the information, in mobilizing people, etc. So there is I will not say just a qualitative change, but a quantitative change because of the amount of information and the amount of mobilization beyond Mali, with the diaspora in France as well, which happened. And you didn't have, I've been working on resistance and mobilization against slavery since the beginning, for the 20th century. And I think here we have a change in numbers in terms of mobilization. And you had, as I said, struggles, resistance to gain freedom, but you didn't have, you had, as in the case of Bouillagui, an entire village refunded and other such villages, but you didn't have joint mobilization beyond one village like it's happening today.
Thank you so much, Marie. So I'm mindful of the time. It's already 5:02, but thank you so much. But I will, okay, if you allow me, I'm going to, no, don't clap yet. I'm not wrapping up the session right now. I'm just, I want, I know everybody's starting to clap as if I was going to say goodbye. I just want to allow you maybe like for a few more minutes, maybe just 5, to answer like 2 follow-up questions that were in the chat, and I think would probably provide a little more, but we'll try to keep it very short. So first, there was a very quick question by Aza about, what do you call modern slavery? And the other was a question by Benedetta Rossi. So Benedetta was asking, so following on the question of Sandra Green, in light of the prison violences against persons of slave descent in CAI, have you and your team considered the possibility that the interviewees in the film might be targeted by descendants of slave owners who see the documentary online? How do you have addressed or have you addressed safeguarding issues? And yeah, I think there's a follow-up question also by Vanessa that also is like highlighting the dilemma of of maybe causing future trauma or supporting their human rights. So I think those are maybe like a way that we can conclude with your perspective on that ethical dilemma of sharing those stories.
Yeah, no, we had questions about safeguarding, of course, and I mean, just to come back to modern slavery, I was thinking of contemporary forms of slavery and understanding the links between historical slavery and modern forms of slavery, and how vulnerable populations already victims of descent-based slavery are more vulnerable to other contemporary forms of slavery. I don't have the time to go much more in details, but so for this specific project, we did the safeguarding, but that was not, the advantages of having the history of Bouillagui known was much stronger for them, I believe, than the risk. And I don't think, maybe I'm naive, but the position of Bouillagui today is relatively safe. Part of people in the village are politicians. They have positions. They are recognized. They are legitimate beyond the village. So I think they are in a position which has little to do with the villages where violence has happened and still happening today, and with which I have decided not to work because of safeguarding issues for myself, for the population themselves. What we work with are the activists who are mostly in the diaspora, but also in Mali. But but for example, we had a training workshop to train the Gambana people. Part of the leaders of Gambana from the diaspora and in Mali for advocacy work. We train them, and when we bring we didn't talk about this training, we didn't publicize it because of safeguarding issues. At some point in Bamako, you had all the leaders of Gambana from the diaspora and from Mali gathered together. So we were very well aware of the risk that they get targeted. That was ideal for the ones who are their enemies. So we didn't publicize this training, and we were very discreet about it. Unfortunately, at some point, people heard about it, and there were threats circulating on WhatsApp in some groups. So we were extremely careful in Bamako, and we hired security. We did everything to check the people who will attend the workshop because there were other guests, and it went well. A lot of people also, you can never know, but in this case there were death threats, but nothing happened. But we were fully aware of that, and we hired extra security and everything to make sure. And we said no social media, no reports of the training during the training. And once you are back home safe, you do whatever you think is good, but don't publicize anything until the training is finished. So we agreed on this kind of safeguarding to prevent any further violence.
Thank you so much, Marie, for presenting this project with us. Like we can all, I think we all took notes of the address of the website. Thank you so much. Yeah, really interesting, and looking forward to hear more about the project, the different aspect of it. And I hope that, you know, doctoral fellows at HUMA would be like, you know, inspired to reflect on their own practices, especially those who are interested in integrating, you know, further like visuals, like films, etc. And there's some of you that are doing it. So yeah, thank you, Marie. We are now going to wrap up the session. We have another doctoral seminars on the 1st of June, and you will hear soon about it. So you'll have the title and the content in a week or so. Thank you so much.
Thanks, bye. Thank you for joining. Bye.
Merci.